Alright folks, so this is the brand new Apple Watch Ultra 3, and what they've done here is taken their quite popular outdoor-focused smartwatch and added more battery life, a larger display, as well as off-grid connectivity with a new satellite messaging feature that isn't just for SOS. This actually has standard text message capabilities over satellite, as well as even a share my location feature. And the Ultra 3 is now joining the ranks of Google with their Pixel Watch 4, as well as Garmin with their new Fenix 8 Pro to deliver satellite communications on a smartwatch, but there actually are some differences in terms of how these all work between the devices. Oh, and before we get into it, so if you haven't checked out my review of the new AirPods Pro 3 yet, so these absolutely blew my mind when it comes to heart rate accuracy, as well as some of the other features that they put inside. So I'll have that video linked down in the description below for you to check out once you're done over here. And then also be on the lookout for my in-depth reviews of both the Series 11 as well as the new SE3, which will be dropping a little bit after this video. All right, so from the outside, so these pretty much remain the same as before, where they have a 49mm case, and the dimensions also look identical from what I can tell. And that also includes the weight, where that looks to be the same too. And there's been a little debate online about the Ultra 3 being thinner, but it's not the actual physical dimensions. It's actually the difference in the spec that they were listing on their website, which was without the heart rate sensor on the Ultra 3 versus with the heart rate sensor on the previous models. But as you can see here, they're exactly the same. However, the Ultra 3 does get a bump in display size, where the new display is about 4% larger than before, and it's sort of noticeable with some watch faces and screens, but I wouldn't necessarily call this a real night and day difference either. However, this does translate into the bezels being thinner by around like 24%, which is nice to see, or maybe not see. And this OLED display also has better wide angle visibility, where it's supposed to be easier to see at a glance at off angle. So think like you'd be able to see your heart rate when you're cycling a little bit easier without taking your hands off the bars. Or if you'd like to see if someone replied to you on Tinder or something like that. And this also has LTPO3 technology inside. So this allows for variable refresh rates, which leads to better battery life. So for instance, in its always on display mode, it can still display the seconds with some select watch faces, but then can crank up that refresh rate when you're actually interacting with the watch. And then just like before, this display has a peak brightness of 3000 nits, which is plenty bright for all sorts of conditions, including the brightest sun, but also maybe more importantly, a low brightness level of 1 nit, which is nice to have at night so the light from the display doesn't necessarily interfere with our circadian rhythms. And they've also introduced these new reflective trail loops alongside the Ultra 3, but these are basically the standard larger Apple Watch band interface that can be used on any of their like 44 or 45mm series models as well as any other Ultra models. So these are available for any of you out there with those. But these are kind of nice, where they just add that nice little extra safety element to these without necessarily being like super shiny under normal circumstances. But another change I think that actually makes a difference is the battery life, where this is also increased on the Ultra 3, where this is claimed to get up to 42 hours of battery life now versus the 36 hours from before. So not quite 2 full days, but I've always tended to get longer battery life than what Apple actually advertised, where even with the Ultra 2, I was getting right around 2 days a lot of the time. And with the Ultra 3, that's definitely the case now, where with even some outdoor activities, and those activities even using LTE, that's looking right around that 2-day mark, if not more. And then when it comes specifically for battery life for recording outdoor activities, so on this right here, I was using LTE the entire time without my phone connected, and it would basically last around 16 hours in this mode, which is actually above their 14-hour estimate for use without an iPhone. So again, above their claims, which is nice to see. And if you're curious about battery life when it comes to sleep tracking, so it looks to be using anywhere from around 7 to 8% per night. And this will obviously depend on the amount of sleep that you get, but even for over 9 hours of sleep on this night, that was like 8%. And I almost never get 9 hours of sleep, and we'll definitely see that a little bit later on in the video. But the Ultra 3 also does have a quick charge feature where you can charge it up for 15 minutes, which they say can get you up to 12 hours of use. So definitely handy if you need to top it off before a run or before you head off to bed. And then when it comes to health features, so the Ultra 3 shares the same heart rate sensor as the previous generation, and more details on accuracy for sports in just one bit. But with that, it also does have an ECG function where it can check for signs of atrial fibrillation or AFib. And then in addition to that, you also do get blood oxygen saturation tracking, which is now again available in the US, but there is a slight difference here versus the functionality they had back with the Series 9 and before, where if you're in the US, you can track your blood oxygen saturation levels, but you won't see that on the watch itself. You actually have to go to the Health app to view that. However, if you live outside the US though, you'll actually see those numbers on the watch. And this is due to a patent dispute, but you can still at least get that data. And the Ultra 3 also comes with their new sleep score feature. So what they're doing here is using 3 different factors to calculate your sleep score. Sleep duration, as in how much time you slept, bedtime consistency, as in what time you go to bed and wake up, as well as any interruptions you had throughout the night. And it'll also track your sleep stages here too, but Apple's sleep score feature is really more about consistency, where it's scoring you based on maintaining a consistent schedule and staying asleep, versus the sleep score from a lot of other brands that not only take in factors like sleep duration and any awake periods throughout the night, but also some other factors like health metrics, like your resting heart rate as well as your heart rate variability. And because this has a lot to do with consistency, well, if you're consistently not getting much sleep, which is basically what's been happening for me lately due to all the things that have been coming out, then even if you get like 6 hours of sleep like on a consistent basis, you still actually may get a decent sleep score here. So this is again more about your routines than it is about the sleep quality when it comes to like health metrics and stuff like that. So that's where the Vitals app would actually come into play here, where you'd use Vitals to track your health stats and how that's trending, and then Sleep Score is more about how well you adhere to your sleep schedule. But do note that the Sleep Score feature isn't exclusive to the Ultra 3, so this is actually supported on any watch that can support watchOS 26. And in addition to that, there's also their breathing disturbances feature, which they announced recently, where it can attempt to detect signs of sleep apnea. But along with that, another thing they're introducing alongside the Ultra 3 are new features surrounding high blood pressure, where they can alert you of any possible signs of hypertension. And how this works is that it basically takes 30 days for your Apple Watch to collect enough baseline data to assess if it finds any possible signs of hypertension. And if it does, you'll get an alert. And at that point, you can go seek out a medical professional to get an actual diagnosis. Now, at the time of this filming, this just got approved, so I haven't been able to test this fully. And I've actually had high blood pressure in the past, so I'm really interested to see if it detects anything with me. So stay tuned after I've been able to use this for a bit more. But do note that this isn't giving you an actual blood pressure reading, like no actual numbers like a blood pressure cuff. All it's doing is basically looking for signs of hypertension, which can help you be aware of any possible high blood pressure that you may have. So this is going to be very much like their sleep apnea feature, where that also takes 30 days to get a baseline, but this is more of a daytime feature, and technically you only actually have to be wearing your watch 14 days out of that first 30 days. And then moving on to the connectivity features of the Ultra 3. So first off, the Ultra 3 also comes with a new 5G modem for cellular connectivity, but they also did add this to the new SE3 as well as the Series 11, at least the cellular models of those. But with this, you should have better coverage, increased speed for downloads, but maybe more importantly, better battery life. And going back to the battery life for tracking outdoor activities that we saw earlier, that seems to be working out. But now let's move on to the satellite messaging capabilities of the Ultra 3, and this is really comprised of 3 different components or uses. So first off, there's an SOS feature for emergencies. There's also messaging for all your regular texts, and there's also a share location feature where you can share your location with a loved one. So with the SOS feature, what you'll be able to do here is contact emergency services in the case of an emergency, and they'll route you to the appropriate services that are needed for your particular situation. But the satellite piece is basically the last resort, where it'll first try to use your phone's cell phone connection, but if that's not available, it'll try to use its own cellular connectivity, and then finally it'll resort to satellites if everything else fails. But the SOS feature also requires you to answer some questions to let emergency services know about your exact situation. So this is going to be very much like Google as well as Garmin's implementation, where it's designed to be used in the same kind of manner where you may call 911, where you need to be conscious enough to interact and to communicate the details of your emergency. So to get a satellite connection, this does take some interaction with you and your watch to get a satellite fix. So you'll need to orient your body and your arm to get into the correct position to acquire a connection. Now, with the kind of satellite connectivity the Ultra 3 has, so these are what they call low Earth orbit satellites, or LEO satellites, where these satellites basically move across the sky, versus geostationary satellites, or geosatellites, which stay in a fixed location in relation to the Earth. So what this means is that the satellite connection won't necessarily be persistent. So you'll first get a satellite fix, and then for a while, you may still have some level of connectivity, but at a certain point, that satellite is probably going to move away. So you may need to reconnect at some point. And with this kind of satellite connectivity, you also need a clear view of the sky. So you may need to move away from like heavy tree cover or anything else that may be interfering with a clear line of sight with the sky. And the SOS feature is going to come free with your Ultra 3 for the first 2 years, but they haven't actually come up with a cost beyond that. And this has actually been the same thing that Apple said with their iPhones, is that it would be free for the first 2 years, but we still haven't seen them charge for that. So who knows at this point. And another thing to note is that this feature is all about getting you in contact with emergency services, not necessarily the cost of the emergency services themselves, which is a completely different story. Now, for the non-emergency, like standard messaging part of this, so this allows you to text with others, and this is basically going to be like standard text messages, where you can send text to both iPhones as well as Android phones. And this is going to be basically standard text messaging, where you can send text, but there's no image or video support, but you can send emojis. Now, there's a couple caveats in terms of who you can actually message from your watch. So with iMessage, you can message anyone that you've iMessaged with in the last 30 days, but with SMS, you can only message them if your phone is online somewhere. So if your phone is dead, you won't actually be able to message someone over SMS. And like I was mentioning earlier, so since these use low Earth orbit satellites, the messaging isn't necessarily going to be persistent like usually what's done over cellular, where with this, you may be able to exchange messages back and forth for a while, but you may need to reconnect the satellites if your satellite moves away. And the last bit to this satellite connectivity is that you can also share your location with loved ones, where all you have to do is either go into the Find My app to share your location from there, or or you can do this from the pop-up menu in iMessage. Now, this isn't really a live tracking feature though, where it's constantly sending your coordinates. Rather, this is more of a manual feature that you can do every 15 minutes. So that's sort of something important to know here. Now, while the SOS feature remains free for the first 2 years, the messaging component as well as the share location feature do require an active cell phone plan with your watch. And you do also need to have your cellular connection open, as it does use that same antenna. So for my testing, I literally had to go outside of cell phone range to have it actually flip over to satellites. And the feature availability will also depend on your region. And I'm just going to go and put all that info up on the screen right now. So these are the current regions that are supported, but I'm sure this list may change in the future. And then when it comes to the sports capabilities of the Ultra 3, so this is going to be basically exactly the same as the Ultra 2s. So this is where you can track like pretty much any sport under the sun, whether that's going to be like running, cycling, tons of gym profiles, both pool swimming as well as open water swimming, triathlon, as well as recreational scuba diving. So basically tons of stuff here, and the same as before. Now, when it comes to GPS accuracy, so the Ultra 3 has the same dual band or multi-band satellite chipset, just like the previous generation. So with this kind of technology, its aim is to deliver higher accuracy in situations where you may have objects interfering with the sky. So think like heavy tree cover, like tall buildings. However, they did actually have to change the antenna design on the Ultra 3 due to the 5G modem as well as the satellite connectivity. And the accuracy is looking to be pretty good out of the Ultra 3 so far from my testing, where I've had zero issues with both total distance as well as the GPS tracks themselves. And even on this right here, which is up a pretty narrow canyon, it performed really well, including the total elevation gain compared to other devices, as well as a reference source, and in this case, that's Strava's corrected elevation figure. Now, if you're looking for GPS accuracy when it comes to open water swimming, well, I'm not really a swimmer, but definitely check out Matt Legrand as well as DC Rainmaker for more details on that. Good guys that put out really good content. Now, I did experience a couple oddities though on that run that we saw earlier, where there was kind of like a rather odd spike with running power, where just in the middle of my run, it kind of like jumped for some reason. And I'm gonna have to do a little bit more testing to see if that keeps happening. Now, for heart rate accuracy, again, the Ultra 3 has the same heart rate sensor as the previous generation, and I'm basically seeing the same thing as before, and that's quite good accuracy for the most part, with just a few exceptions. Now, I do want to note is that if you're using the new AirPods Pro 3s along with your Ultra 3 at the same time with the workout app, it can actually fuse that data together. So for all these tests though, this was the Ultra 3 all on its own with a completely different iPhone as well as a completely different iCloud account from the one I was using with the AirPods Pro 3. So this is just heart rate data out of this watch. But I am going to have a follow-up video about how that like fusion aspects works between these two, so stay tuned for that. Anyhow, starting with this indoor ride here, well, that's picture perfect, and I literally could not find one spot where it wavered. Seriously, so good, but most if not all watches do well with indoor riding because we're usually in a static position and there's really not much for a watch to deal with. However, for riding outdoors, so this is where we can start to see heart rate accuracy drift versus indoor riding, where when we're riding outside, there's more variables for a watch to deal with, like bumps and vibrations in the road. And what you can see here is there's a slight difference in accuracy between the Ultra 3 I was wearing on one wrist, which is in orange, versus the Series 11, which is on my other wrist that's in purple. And basically what I've seen over the like decade or so that I've been doing this is that larger and heavier watches can sometimes be less accurate than a lighter watch with the exact same heart rate sensor. And that's just due to physics, where if a watch is larger and heavier, it may have a tendency of bouncing around on the wrist a little bit more than something lighter. So that's most likely what's going on here. It's not like I'd call this wildly inaccurate by any means, and I'd still totally rely on it, but the Ultra 3 may wander a little bit more than, let's say, something like the Series 11. But then when it comes to running, so interestingly, this is rock solid out of the Ultra 3, where this was just like indoor cycling, where I can barely tell any difference at all. And I think the difference here, by the way, versus cycling is that although our arms are moving quite a bit with running, there's generally specific algorithms that companies use to gauge better heart rate while running. So for instance, to avoid like a cadence lock issue where sometimes a watch can actually misinterpret the rhythm of our footsteps as heart rate. But Apple tends to do a really good job of running heart rate, and that trend seems to continue here too. Now, when it comes to weight training and high intensity interval training, so these aren't going to be as predictable as running, where there's all sorts of different things for a watch to deal with here, like gripping on handles, tensing our wrists a lot, as well as any like wild arm movement. And these activities is where I start to see watches wander a bit. So like in this workout, so this is a combination of rowing, the ski erg, as well as some wall balls. So kind of like a wide variety of stuff here. And while it's actually not bad, it's still a little bit farther off than, let's say, running as well as indoor cycling. And where I saw it wander more were the rowing and ski erg portions where I was gripping onto a handle. However, the wall ball portions where I was actually throwing a medicine ball were actually really good. But again, these are actually pretty good results out of the Ultra 3, but I actually have seen on the Ultra 2, like on this workout that I did earlier this year, where it kind of missed the boat with the first set of rowing. And the good news is that if you're doing some of those activities where you're not necessarily getting accurate heart rate, you can use the Ultra 3 with an external Bluetooth heart rate strap if you like, but you can also use it in conjunction with your AirPods Pro 3s with its built-in heart rate sensors. And that's actually what you see in the light blue color in that workout. And again, definitely check out my in-depth review of those because those kind of blew me away in terms of accuracy. So with the new Ultra 3, well, it's basically all about that new satellite connectivity, and in terms of if it's worth the upgrade, well, that kind of probably all depends on if you plan to go outside of cell phone coverage where you can utilize those features. And the longer battery life, I do have to say, is nice to have, where it does kind of like reduce that battery anxiety a bit, and in my case, for the most part, I know I can get at least 2 days out of mine now. And the other changes are nice updates too, but it's just like most generations of things nowadays where they're just updating the next new model versus having something completely different. They're basically taking something that's been working and improving on it with the latest technology. And in this case, it just makes for a more connected, outdoor-focused smartwatch that also serves really well as a great daily driver if you're on an iPhone. And there's always some debate about Apple's battery life compared to some of its competitors, which is totally valid, but the seamless connectivity between this watch and an iPhone does pull some people over from watches that may have way longer battery life, but not this level of integration. But again, it's great that we at least have those choices. Anyhow, that's the Apple Watch Ultra 3, but also be on the lookout for my in-depth reviews of the Series 11 as well as the SE3 that I'll be dropping a little bit after this video. But in the meantime, have fun out there, and we will see you in the next video.